Hello, fellow NASA Hunch teachers and students. My name is Miss Brittany Coger, and I'm going to be walking you through the soil investigation station for our lunar projects here at the NASA HUNCH Academy. Remember, this is meant to be taught however you can teach it. If you can teach it whole group, individually, or small group, and do it however you can. Lots of science lessons were tied into this station. So I'm going to kind of go over just a quick overview of what I talked about and then how I did this with my students. So you have chosen one of the lunar projects. We have the lunar brick mold, the lunar scooter wheel, the lunar chair, lots of lunar projects, and they all have to do with the moon. Lunar is the moon. So we've got to know about the soil of the moon versus the soil here on Earth. So that's what this station is about, is looking into the soil here on Earth and why it is different from the soil on the moon. Now, there are lots of science lessons you can go off on. You can talk about weather, the atmosphere, weather tools, the water cycle. The water cycle is very important to go over, so I do hope that you discuss that with your students. We talked about the scientific method, the engineering design process, concave and convex lenses, and we also talked about force and motion, and that gravity is a force that constantly pulls us down here on Earth. So we discussed all of that. I discussed that whole group with my students. We discussed the moon landing. We watched the moon landing. I showed my students the pictures of the shoe prints on the moon, talked about Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong's trip to the moon on Apollo 11 in 1969. We watched those videos. We talked about why we went to the moon and the space race. So all of that can be involved as well. Go off into as many science topics as you can, history topics, anything that you can pull into NASA would be wonderful to discuss with your students. But I'm just going to show you quickly what I did with my students for this lesson today. So if we're looking at the moon, and we got to talk about what we know about the moon, okay? First, think about what the moon looks like, and I pulled a picture of the moon up on my board so the students could see the moon. They see that it is very gray. We discussed what it looked like. I wrote down their answers, like what do you see on this moon? What colors do you see? What do you notice? And they noticed that the surface was very gray. It looked rocky and hard. They said the craters were really cool, the deep craters. They didn't know what happened to those. They thought maybe those were old volcanoes. It was very interesting to see what my students thought. Even what do you think the surface of the moon is made of? So we came up with a hypothesis. We did an educated guess, and they told me what they thought about the moon. And we discussed the color and why all of that. We discussed our five senses because we're going to be using our five senses in this station. And then we discussed what it looks like here on Earth. I said, okay, what do we notice here on Earth? What do you know about the surface here on Earth? They're like, well, it's covered with dirt, sand, soil, rock, grass. There's all these things on Earth. I said, okay, well, what else is on Earth that is not on the moon? Took them a minute, but they realized the moon has no water. There is no weather on the moon. There is no wind. There is an atmosphere that surrounds the moon, which a lot of people think there is no atmosphere on the moon. There is a small atmosphere around the moon, and it's a small layer of gas. That's what it is. Now, Earth has a multi-layered atmosphere, and this would be a wonderful time to go off into an atmosphere lesson so you can talk about the different layers of the atmosphere with your students. And that atmosphere is what protects Earth from things hitting us. Meteors, asteroids, comets, rocks floating around in space, and things like that. None of that can get into our atmosphere. Normally it burns up. If you've watched anything re-enter our atmosphere or watched a rocket go into the atmosphere or them launching satellites, you will notice that there is like a very hot, you'll notice that it gets very hot in our atmosphere and things burn up. So if you've seen a shooting star, you've seen a meteor coming into our atmosphere and burning up, and that's what we see and we wish upon. So now you know that is something that got burned up and our atmosphere is protecting us. Now, the moon does not have all of that atmosphere to protect it, so it's been hit for millions of years with things just crashing into it. And if you've ever broken a rock here on Earth, just thrown a rock down and broke it, does it break smooth? And we had this discussion with my students. I said, does it break smooth? They're like, no, it's going to be sharp. There's going to be pieces that are pointed. We talked about what it might look like. And think about that on the moon. Yes, it's a hard, rocky surface. It's covered in like a layer of sand and dust. It's very fine and thin. If you think of flour, how flour kind of poofs, there is that as well. The moon has 1/6 of our gravity, so there, it doesn't float away. It does go back down. but it does kind of poof and it is like that. But what happens if something hits and breaks those pieces off? Those pieces are still going to be sharp and pointed. So there are sharp, pointy pieces, almost like shards of glass on the moon. So we don't want our astronauts to get that in their spacesuits. So we want to protect our astronauts. So it's very important to know about the regolith, which is the surface of the moon. We went into the layers of Earth and the different layers and went through the layers, and the outer layer is the crust, and that's what we're talking about today. When we're looking at our soil investigation today, we're talking about that outer layer, that crust. But our water cycle and our weather, our atmosphere, all of that is very important for why our Earth is shaped the way that it is and the things that happen and the controlling processes here on Earth. So please discuss those with your students. Talk about the atmosphere and the weather and the water cycle. I also talked about concave and convex lenses because we're going to be using a magnifying glass, and that is a convex lens. So it points out. A concave would go in. And we did a little lesson on concave versus convex lenses. So you're going to need a couple of things. You're going to need a magnifying glass, and you're going to need a couple of cups of soil, dirt, sand, rocks, anything that you got out there from. You can go outside and just dig up a little bit of dirt. I got some potting soil, and I got some sand and some rocks, and then there's some mud there because it's been raining a lot here at my house here in Georgia. So we took our hand lens. I showed them how to use it correctly because I always have this. Somebody always puts it directly through their eye. Yes, look how big it made my eye. That's really cool to see. But that doesn't help you see things up close. You got to get it closer to what you are looking at. So a lot of kids, that is a misconception. They want to put it right here. So pull it away from your eye and get it to what you are looking at. We talked about our senses and how touch and sound and sight, smell, all those things. We talked about the 5 senses. And we did a misconception map and a KWL chart, a know, want, learn chart. And I asked them, we made hypothesis before we touched any of this. I said, look at this dirt. Look at this potting soil, okay? I wanted to know why you think it looks the way that it does. What do you think it's going to feel like? What color do you see? What do you see in it? So we wrote all of that down on the board, and then I had them just stick their hands in there and feel it with their fingers. Just pick it up, rub it between your fingers, and I said, rub it really hard. Is anything sticking in you? No. They noticed that in our potting soil, there are some pieces of wood in there and broken down pieces, and some of those can be sharp. So they did notice that. I said, do you think that would have come from a river or from an ocean or somewhere where it's been moved around? No, that's probably came from the land. So we discussed weathering, erosion, and deposition. After we touched that, we felt that. I asked them, so what process do you think caused that? And our controlling processes of Earth are weathering, erosion, and deposition, or WED, WED. Weathering is breaking down. So yes, the moon has been weathered. Things have been breaking down on the moon for years. But here on Earth, the breaking down of materials is done with water, wind, ice, plants, animals, or chemicals. That's what breaks things down. But think about if you've ever been walking down the sidewalk and seen a piece of grass or something coming up through the sidewalk, poking through a tree root, breaking through the sidewalk. That's how plants can cause weathering. Animals digging up and underneath rocks and stuff can break them down as well. But water, wind, and ice are big factors there, okay? Water running over it after time is going to just erode it. Think about our canyons, our Grand Canyon. I have Cloudland Canyon here in Georgia. That was formed by water running over it and breaking down those pieces of rock over and over and over again. In the desert where the wind is blowing, that wind is like sandpaper. It's hitting those rocks and it's pulling that little pieces off at a time, and it shapes it. If you've seen those beautiful archways in Utah and out west, then that's what changed those and shaped those was weathering. All right, so weathering is that process that breaks down. Erosion is the important part, and I took my hands with my students and we moved it. Erosion is picking up those weathered pieces, those broken pieces, and rolling it around with water, wind, or ice. Think about in the desert as the wind blows, how that sand rubs against things. If you've ever used sandpaper rubbed over things helps make it smooth. So that's what's happened with erosion. Erosion is that process that smooths things out. And since there's no wind or water on the moon, you can't have erosion. And then deposition is the dropping. We dropped. And that builds up sand dunes and deltas and things. And that's that sediment that has been moved along and it's dropped into new places. So weathering, erosion, and deposition are controlling processes that can build up Earth, or which is constructing, or destroying and breaking it down. It can break down Earth. So now that they knew the weathering, erosion, and deposition, look back at your cup. What process do you think caused that to fill that way? We looked at it up close, we felt it, we wrote down what we saw. Same thing with the sand. We stuck our hands in there, we felt it, rubbed it in between our fingers. We wrote down what we felt and what we thought it looked like. We made our hypothesis first. We wrote down what it looked like, and then we took our magnifying glass and we looked at it up close. And this was really cool because they got to see some pieces of salt, and they were like, oh, there's diamonds, there's crystals. So it was really cool to see what they thought was actually in sand. And I told them, I said, that's a lot of that salt or broken down pieces. It could be a crystal that could have got broken down over time. But they noticed how rounded those little balls of sand were and those little pieces in sand were. And I was like, think about the ocean. Think about where sand is at. What is happening? It's being rolled against other pieces. And then we looked at our mud the same way. And then we did the same thing with the rocks. And I asked them, where do you think those rocks came from? Was that in a river? Was that out on land? Do you think that was in the desert? Where do you think that rock came from? So there was lots of discussions. We did the KWL charts. We did misconception maps. We wrote things down. We turned and talked with our partners. We compared our data at the end, and we had everything up. And we're going to use all of this data for our layered projects as we go into our lunar projects. So I hope you had fun with this investigation station. I hope you had fun looking at some soil and learning about our controlling processes of Earth and learning why the moon does not have those controlling processes. And now we're going to learn more about our lunar projects. I can't wait to see you at the next station. Have fun, guys, and I'll see you later.